So today we have another interview with the developers of the Final Fantasy VII franchise as they touch on the original game's dev history and how it's helping shape the Remake Trilogy, and how moving along with this project has given them a little bit more confidence moving into Part 3. So if any of that sounds cool to you, feel free to click the like button, and if you're new here and you'd like to stick around, you can subscribe, and as always, leave your thoughts in the comments down below. So this interview comes to us from Edge magazine number 405, where they got to sit down with Yoshinori Kitase as well as Naoki Hamaguchi to talk all things FF7. Now, I do have to put a disclaimer, there will be spoilers in this video. I've had some complaints in previous videos that I have spoiled things for people. We are talking about FF7 OG as well as Remake and Rebirth, so there will be massive spoilers, just a warning. Second, because this article comes from a paid magazine, unfortunately, I don't think I can include any screenshots of the quotes or the article itself. Some publications are really iffy about that stuff and will not hesitate to send out a copyright claim on your content if that stuff happens. So unfortunately, I won't be able to put any quotes in this video. Massive apology on my part. I know there's a lot of people that when they watch these videos, they love to read along to my narration when we are reading these quotes. So unfortunately, we won't be able to do that this go around. So moving into the article, they start off with the structure of the Remake Trilogy and how Kitase recalls that Rebirth picks up with the middle of the original game story, but also still ends in the middle section, and how that made it a little bit tricky to figure out the entire structure of the franchise. And with that, Hamaguchi would then go on to say, when our scriptwriter Kazuhige Nojima submitted his script for Rebirth, I remember thinking that I'd rather do it in a different way. So Nojima's original scenario probably went way past the point of us losing Aerith, but for the structure of all of these games and trying to make things flow better, Hamaguchi would pitch that maybe they should end it when Aerith dies. Kitase would then go on to say, there was definitely a debate. At one point, we thought maybe we could put everything in just 2 games. Then later, we thought it needed to be 4. But once they started continuing with development and they realized how much material they had to work with, that's when they settled on 3 being the magic number. And I also think that that's a really good structure for Rebirth in particular. It is really tricky to pick up halfway through a story and end that specific section still in the middle section of the story, but I think they did a good enough job when it came to the narration and the storytelling and including newer elements like, having Zack kind of supplement some of the chapters, even if it was very brief. I think they still did a good job in ending that second game, with the death of Aerith and having things be really unclear. Is she really dead? Is she alive in a different world? What's going on with Cloud and how he's envisioning this entire act playing out? He's, even more of an unreliable narrator, but it also fits the theme of a trilogy. When you're doing a trilogy, the second part of a trilogy is usually the darkest entry in that project, and it a lot of times can end on a massive cliffhanger or on a real down note for the characters. And naturally losing Aerith just kind of fits that structure of a trilogy. You've lost an important, incredible character. Our party has a win, but they also have a massive loss. So what's going to happen to them in the next story? It really does build intrigue moving into Part 3 to see where are these characters going to go next. Now, what's really cool is they have a theme for each part of this trilogy. Hamaguchi would go on to say that the theme of Final Fantasy VII Remake was reunion, which fit perfectly. You look at when Remake was first announced, this really was a reunion of us, the fans, getting to see these characters again for who knows how long it had been at that point, 15 plus years at that point. And Hamaguchi would go on to describe it as this combination of nostalgia and discovery that you would experience at a high school reunion by saying, when you meet friends you haven't seen in many years and discover they're still the same people, but with new aspects in their lives. Which is pretty accurate. Seeing these characters come back, that familiarity comes back with them. But there's also some new things like, hey, did you do a little something different with your hair? Or you've got a new job, or maybe you meet up with friends who, show up at the reunion and they claim to be the inventors of Post-it notes. Bonus points for anyone who understands that reference. But it can be really fun and exciting, but also kind of nerve-wracking to kind of meet up with people you haven't seen in a while. Now for me, I was not invited to my high school reunion. And it's not because I'm a bad person. I just flew under the radar in high school. I was so under the radar that when the yearbooks came out, they had sections in the yearbook that awarded different awards to different people, like most outspoken, most popular. There was a category for quietest kid in the school. I didn't even get that one. I was still under the radar. That award would go to somebody I knew by the name of Richard. I will not give his last name because I won't put him on blast, but he was a really good kid, super smart, great at piano, always kind and polite. So Richard, if you're out there, I hope you're doing well. But that's just me telling you like how under the radar I was. But even then, like whenever you do a reunion of anything, whether it's high school or families or friends you haven't seen in a while, it's very nerve-wracking, but that familiarity is still there, which is super sick. Now for Rebirth, their defining word for that game was bonds, not James Bond, but B-O-N-D-S, the bonds you have with the people around you. And Hamaguchi would explain that further by saying, the reason is very simple. The climax of the story is that final emotional shattering moment when we discover what's happened to Aerith. To make that payoff, we needed to build up the bonds between the characters, so you care about them. And they do such a phenomenal job, I think, with bonds in Rebirth and really making the player feel that. And again, one of the things I love to stress is that the developers don't do things just to do things. And Rebirth is the best example of that because they do story stuff with these characters where we see them getting closer and bonding and learning about each other. And they take that story aspect and put it into the gameplay, where these characters are now really learning about each other. They're working together. They're doing really cool synergy stuff with the synergy skills and abilities and really working together. And there are so many great moments in this story where you see characters like Tifa and Aerith really bond with one another, which I love because I know that there's a section of the fandom that loves to pit them against each other, which I don't understand, but these are two people who are genuine friends with one another and they confide in each other. You know, at the beginning of Rebirth, Tifa talks to Aerith about how she's unsure of the stuff that Cloud is saying. How could he know the events of Nibelheim when she remembers him not being there? And then later on in the story, we discover Aerith's been confiding in Tifa about Zack. And Tifa asks Aerith, like, hey, when, they get to Gongaga, have you heard anything new about Zack? And they do such a wonderful job with all of these characters growing these bonds, Barrett and Yuffie, starting off as like a fangirl with Yuffie being a big fan of Barrett and Avalanche, and then they start to butt heads, and then by the end of the game, it's like a father-daughter kind of relationship. And again, that's woven throughout everything, not just the story, not just the combat, but those little interactions those characters get in the side quests. It's everywhere, and they do such a fantastic job of that. Now up next, they talk about more of the structure of these games and how they've been progressing, which is something we've stressed on my channel for quite some time. You start off with 7 Remake, which is super linear. You're confined to Midgar. It's very straightforward. And then once you finally leave Midgar, you get to explore the world a little bit more. You don't get access to the entire planet, but you get a pretty good chunk of all these different regions with different NPCs and enemies and side quests to do. And that's pretty much how the original game was structured. And then the third section, it's here's the high wind, here's a bunch of chocobos, just go crazy and have fun exploring every nook and cranny of this environment. And again, that's what I think Remake Part 3 will be. It will be that open world adventure where we get to go everywhere and do so many things without necessarily being held by the hand. Now up next, they deal with something that was kind of a big topic for this trilogy, and that's how much do they change and how much do they keep the same. And for Kitase, someone who was, one of the OG developers, his mindset was, we really probably should change up a lot. And that was brought up recently with how he wanted to change the look of the reactors, and Hamaguchi was like, look man, if there's one thing that stays the same, we gotta keep that iconic image of the reactors. People just know them way too well, we can't change that up too much. Kitase goes on a little bit further to talk about that. He goes on to say, I thought if we just reproduce the original game with no changes, it will feel nostalgic, but not exciting. And fans of the original who know everything that's coming will soon get bored. But eventually he would learn that, maybe if we deviate a little too much, that could turn off a large section of the fans because this franchise belongs to us as much as it does to them. And those are Kitase's words, not mine. And the last thing he would want to do is alienate more people. He continues by saying essentially half of Final Fantasy VII, or maybe even more, is now owned by the fans. It belongs to them as well as us. Specifically in terms of their attachment to the characters, I realized we needed to be cautious in not changing those characters by turning them into different kinds of people. Which, for me, I think they did a really good job of that because it kind of goes both ways. Even if we know what's coming and they didn't change anything, it still makes it exciting to experience it with today's technology, with the graphics that we have and the combat stuff we're able to do with this trilogy in particular. So I think it still would have been fresh, but the fact that they did change up not all of the big story points, but how we get to those story points, they deviated just a little bit. Makes it really fun and exciting, like seeing Roche show up. I'm like, who is this maniac? He wasn't in the original game, but he's a really fun new addition to this trilogy. And it makes you as a player kind of start to second guess, like, hang on, are they going to actually follow the path that we know so well? Or are they going to deviate and really make us second guess what's happening? So the story changes are great. As far as the characters, these are still the characters we know and love from the original game, but they now have the opportunity to just flesh them out so much more, and it's so satisfying to learn so much more about these characters and their personality quirks, down to like the little things about what they like to eat. There's a really great side quest in Rebirth when you're in the Corel Beach area, and Tifa's talking about the menu of Seventh Heaven and what she would want to put on it. And her and Cloud get into this really cute discussion about the foods they loved and the foods they didn't like eating, and how they didn't realize as kids they kind of had it really good when it came to the food because they didn't have to worry about it. They had people like their parents making it for them. I love stuff like that. And Kitase even brings up the aspect of the Whispers who were introduced in Remake, and how when we first saw the Whispers show up, it's like, okay, hang on, what are these things? Because that is kind of like what signals to players that, hey, some stuff will stay the same, some stuff might be a little bit different. So you could argue that maybe the Whispers maybe hit things on the head a little too obviously to signal to players like, okay, this is what's, really going on. But there are some really fun inside fan jokes about how the Whispers represent the Final Fantasy VII purists, those people that are like, hey, you cannot change anything, you must not change anything, it must stay the same, which I always got a kick out of. Which leads into the death of Aerith and how they decided to portray it instead in Rebirth, where Kitase goes on to say, we wanted it to feel more subtle and to give players the possibility to interpret it in different ways, which they've talked about numerous times before, about like the whole goal was to represent the ending in a way that was confusing, to get people talking, kind of to tide them over for part 3, and they freaking nailed it. That section of the game plays out and we're like, hang on, what's going on? Did Cloud block Sephiroth's sword? Did he actually fail? And when you really dig into, a lot of the theories out there, it really feels like there are two different scenarios from two different worlds kind of playing out bit by bit, or it could, be more of the Genova manipulation kind of stuff we've talked about. It's very intriguing, and it leads to some really great discussions on what the heck is actually going on. Now, up next, we have a fun little Q&A from Hamaguchi in regards to Queen's Blood. And they ask Hamaguchi at what point they decided to add Queen's Blood to Rebirth. He would go on to say, the card games in Final Fantasy VIII and IX left a strong impression on me. They are what I think of most when it comes to minigames in the series, so I wanted to do something similar in our game. The aim for Queen's Blood was to offer something that the player could customize and play repeatedly throughout the game. He would even go on to talk about how they created a physical mock-up, which we've seen pictures of in past videos, but they also would create a Windows application to help them keep track and tally the scores. That's how much dedication they had. Like, okay, we need to create some sort of application in Windows that gives us a rough prototype of what this game is going to play out to be. And he wanted to make sure that it actually did have a story that players could follow, that I thought they did a really great job on. Queen's Blood as a story really does mirror a lot of elements of the FF7 story, from the Cetra to, someone like Genova, and how these cards kind of work, and the mystery throughout Rebirth of what the heck is going on? What happened to this man who created Queen's Blood that, drove him mad? And then eventually having that confrontation, which I think the name of the enemy was the Scarlet Witch. I can't remember her name right now, but having that really cool confrontation where you play against her and she just breaks every rule imaginable. This woman does not play by the rules of Queen's Blood. She's throwing out card after card that she shouldn't be able to. It's a little frustrating, but once you find out how to beat her and you get that really cool conclusion where Vincent gets involved and he saves Cloud's butt, it's super awesome stuff. Now, they also do give a little bit of a tidbit on how, for Rebirth, Tetsuya Nomura was the creative director, and his job was ensuring that the tone and aesthetic of his original work was preserved for contemporary audiences, which, again, I think they do a really good job of. And the thing with Nomura is that he is a bit of a polarizing figure within the Final Fantasy world, but I think he gets a lot more crap than he should, because he's technically responsible for some of the more iconic, great parts of the original game. For example, after Aerith died, and in the later section of the story, when the characters parachute back into Midgar, all but 3 characters were going to die. That's what Kitase wanted to do. The player would pick the 3 characters they wanted in their party, and then everyone else would just get obliterated, which is horrifying. And if you do that, you don't have the compilation of FF7. You don't have Advent Children. You might not even have the Remake Trilogy. And Nomura was actually the person who put a stop to that. He's like, look, man, you cannot do that. That's insane. And then Nojima would chime in and say, like, you know, it actually does make sense, because if we have the death of Aerith and then later on we kill a bunch of more characters in our party, it really does dilute Aerith's death and it has less impact. So Nomura was responsible for a lot of great stuff, and there's a little bit more we'll touch on in terms of combat and how Nomura actually influenced some of the OG aspects of FF7 to remain in the trilogy. Now up next, they talk a little bit about how they wanted to make sure that there weren't too many cooks in the kitchen when it came to crafting the story of this trilogy. Hamaguchi would go on to say, I am a strong believer in that the idea that too many cooks spoil the broth. If there are too many people inputting, giving ideas and opinions on what needs to be there, what needs to change, the work can easily lose its character. He continues by saying, obviously a scenario writer is working in text as per a screenplay. It was our task to consider how those directions would play out in an interactive context. And there were several points where we had to change the script to better communicate the feeling the script writer wanted to evoke via a game. We don't change the core concepts, but we tweak the execution, which I imagine is a really difficult challenge to kind of overcome, where you have someone who writes a really great scenario that's got some really great ideas, but then you get to the actual dev aspect of it and it's like, okay, how on earth are we going to take the written text and find a way to implement it into a way that works gameplay wise? And I think that by them keeping it to like a smaller group of people that had input on the majority of the project, you know, again, to speak on what Hamaguchi says, it avoids spoiling the broth, because now you've got your trusted cooks in the kitchen making that broth and everyone knows what everyone is doing. The left hand knows what the right hand is doing, essentially. Now up next comes the thing that I really love, probably like the second most about this trilogy, and a lot of other people love too, is the combat and how they really did want to try and pay respects to the original game's turn-based combat. To speak more on that, Hamaguchi would continue by saying the materia system and the ATB battle system were core elements of the original, but we couldn't just copy them exactly. That would feel old-fashioned. It wasn't about restricting ourselves to what Final Fantasy VII was, but rather reinterpreting those elements to create something accessible and exciting as a modern game. Now, some people may take issue with that previous statement about it feeling old-fashioned, but he's not wrong. You know, turn-based is an older type of gameplay mechanic, which, you know, it still ages well, but it is still considered old-fashioned. And there are so many franchises that have either moved into action completely or have found ways like the Remake Trilogy or even games like Metaphor to take turn-based and mix it in with the action stuff. And I think that hybrid combat mechanic they came up with for the Remake Trilogy really is, again, the best of both worlds. You're helping evolve the Final Fantasy franchise moving forward with the action stuff, which feels really good. Teruki Endo did such a phenomenal job kind of coming up with the blueprint for that battle system and then finessing it for like 6 months. But staying true to the original by taking elements of turn-based, like the command-based menu system, the use of ATB, it still has the spirit of the original FF7. And I know there are the purists out there that, you know, don't like the new combat. They just wanted traditional turn-based combat like the original game had. But again, you really got to take into consideration that the devs really do want to do something a little different. So being able to do everything in real time, from attacking to dodging to, you know, parrying, feels super good. And like there's those flow states I get into with this game's combat where, you know, you got an enemy on the ropes and I'm using Cloud and then I use a focus strike to build up the pressure bar, and then I swap over to Barret to build up the pressure bar, and then I swap over to Tifa to do maximum damage. It's just so well crafted. And again, it really is the original turn-based combat just being done in real time now. And what's interesting from what I've researched, and there's actually a really great article from Polygon that is super long, and I'd love to make a video on that, but I think that actually might be better suited for like a live stream environment where, you know, like if I sat down and read the article with you guys in real time and actively got your opinions on things, that could be a really cool experience. But I'd have to figure out the whole, you know, live streaming stuff and like, do I do it on YouTube? Do I do it on Twitch? But that's neither here nor there. But from what I remember researching, initially Kitase wanted the game to be a straight up action game, more in line with what we got with Kingdom Hearts. But Nomura was the one who was like, look, we have to stay true to some elements of that original game for the fans. We can't just alter it too much because then it doesn't feel faithful to the original. And you take that into consideration with what Hamaguchi is saying, what they came up with, is great. And again, Nomura gets a lot of crap, but a lot of the great stuff that came out of 7 and this trilogy is from Nomura. He's got some banger ideas. Not every idea is a home run, but the ones that are hit super hard. So up next, this is what we're going to end on, but the Edge article really kind of points out about how doing a trilogy really is a big risk. You have some people that don't want to get invested. Trilogies can also sometimes be, a bit unappealing commercially, because it's like, wait, I got to play another game just to understand this game, on top of, sales maybe not being great for Rebirth and this market constantly shifting. None of that has really seemed to affect the developers because it really does feel like a passion project for them. And Kitase even had some worries about that, even though they had people like Hamaguchi and, other unnamed devs on this team who grew up playing the original FF7, who would then go on to be the devs making the Remake Trilogy. Even though they loved it, he was still kind of uncertain at first. But he would go on to say, so many of the original game's fans now work in the industry. Remaking such a widely beloved game was risky. Kitase then would go on to talk about how the reception, however, to Remake and Rebirth was so great and so warm from the fans that it's been a really gratifying experience for him and the team. And he ends by saying the level of excitement, expectation, and intrigue towards the third part of the series has been solidly built up. So yes, I am reassured, and it's certainly a weight off my shoulders to know we didn't mess it up. And to get Hamaguchi's perspective, he talked about being really nervous about the open world aspect of Rebirth, and he wasn't sure how players were going to respond to it, but since it's been mostly positive, he feels pretty good and much more confident, and he ends by saying, now we really feel the responsibility, referencing the work on part 3. So again, obviously whenever you're remaking something that is super beloved, you're gonna have a split audience and you're never gonna satisfy everybody. But the people that do end up liking said project tend to really like it, and that's somebody like me. I'm wearing a Final Fantasy VII Rebirth t-shirt right now as I make this video, and I was just so in love with what they did with Remake and how they expanded things in Rebirth, and Rebirth has quickly become one of my top games of all time because again, it really does kind of offer everything I personally look for in a fantastic video game. And I think they do a great job of paying respect to the OG FF7 in terms of the story and the characters and the combat and the music, while also expanding on things to make them feel new and fresh and exciting. And you might turn a corner expecting a familiar character or scenario, but then you're hit in the face with something completely brand new that makes you question, okay, there's something new here going on, what is it gonna be? And I think that, again, the people that played Rebirth really loved it. I see a lot of comments on these videos ranging from negative to in the middle, but a lot of them are super positive, and so many people view this as their game of the year. And I think that the foundation they've laid in Rebirth really does set them up to have Remake Part 3, honestly, probably be the best in the trilogy. Now again, they do have to land the story without crashing and burning, but as far as like the gameplay mechanics go, there's so much more to look forward to. We're gonna get the entire planet to explore now and have a truly open world game. We're gonna get the Highwind, a plethora of chocobos. We're most likely gonna evolve combat even further to include things like synergy attacks with 3 characters, or synergy limits that really show the bonds that these characters have built up together. And with these developers at the wheel, they clearly understand what made the original so special, and they realize with the combination of the OGs like Kitase, Nomura, and Nojima, in combination with newer people like Hamaguchi and Teruki Endo, it's a really great blend of staying true to the original and evolving in certain aspects where it is needed. So moving into part 3, I'm honestly not really that nervous or worried. I'm just more or less excited to finally experience the end of this trilogy and to see what surprises they have in store for us when it comes to the story. And who knows, you might have the younger generation, find themselves really loving this Remake Trilogy, and maybe one day they grow up to become game developers and they're working on the next Final Fantasy. It's really cool how this all works. And again, this is just a franchise that we all really love and hold near and dear to our hearts and have really influenced, maybe our careers or who we are as people. So a lot of people like to joke about video games just being, a pastime or a waste of time, but they really are no different from a really good movie or a really good book or TV show that you can just kind of sink yourself into, but actually be a part of because you get to play it. So this is just super exciting. I find the dev history on this stuff so intriguing, and learning more and more about the process of this whole trilogy in the original is just so much fun. So with that being said, that is the video. Let me know in the comments down below what you guys thought of this article from Edge magazine with Kitase and Hamaguchi. And in the comments down below, let me know what part of the original FF7 story that hasn't been covered yet are you most excited to see show up in Remake Part 3. I am Curious Corduroy. That is the video. I will see you guys in the next one. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.